The world of Karos 4 was quiet except for the sound of the storm. The wind howled across the empty plains, carrying a thick green mist that burned anything it touched. The rain fell in slow, heavy drops, each one sizzling when it hit metal or stone. Acid rain had turned this planet into a graveyard of machines. Broken ships, forgotten cities, and rusted towers stood like skeletons in the endless storm. Beneath a half-buried transport ship, a small creature shivered. Her white skin glowed faintly under the flickering sky. She was young, barely hatched, and too weak to move far. Her breathing was shallow, and the acid rain that slipped through cracks in the metal left small burns across her back. She cried softly, her voice lost in the storm. She had been hiding for days, hoping the pain would stop, hoping someone would come. But no one did. The creature, known among her kind as Leary, did not understand why she was alone. She remembered the warmth of her mother's arms, the hum of their small shelter, and the distant sound of machines. Then there had been the explosions. The sky had burned bright, and her family had told her to run. She had run until her legs gave out, until the acid rain came and she could go no further. Now she lay beneath the wreckage, her tears mixing with the burning rain. Outside, the storm grew stronger. The wind ripped through the valley, throwing dust and ash through the air. The smell of chemicals filled the world. The ground hissed and steamed, small rivers of acid running between broken stones. Karos 4 was once full of life, but now it was a place no one wanted to remember. The mining colonies had left long ago when the storms became too strong. Only scavengers and desperate people came here now. Far away, a small ship flew low through the storm. It was an old cargo hauler, patched together with parts from a dozen other models. Its engines coughed and sputtered as it fought the wind. Inside sat a man wearing a worn-out flight suit and a heavy-breathing mask. His name was Miles Carter. He was a mechanic and a salvager. He came to Karos 4 to find metal, tools, and parts left behind by the miners. He had been flying from one wreck to another all day, scanning for anything valuable. Miles checked the radar and saw nothing but the storm. He was tired, and his ship was almost out of fuel. He was ready to turn back when a faint signal flashed on his screen. A weak heat source, small but steady. He frowned and leaned closer. It wasn't metal and it wasn't machinery. It looked alive. He hesitated. There shouldn't be any life on Karos 4. The air itself was poison, and the rain could eat through armor in minutes. Still, the signal was there and it was close. With a quiet sigh, he turned the ship toward the signal and descended through the green mist. The scanner guided him to the remains of a large transport ship, half buried in the ground. The hull was covered in rust and acid scars. Miles put on his protective suit and stepped out into the storm. The acid hissed against his armor, leaving small trails of smoke. He walked carefully, his boots sinking into the wet ground. The sound of the rain on his helmet was deafening. He found the heat source beneath the wreckage. The scanner beeped softly, and when he moved a piece of twisted metal aside, he froze. There, curled up and trembling, was a small white creature. She was no bigger than a child, her skin almost transparent. The rain that fell through the cracks burned her shoulders, but she was too weak to move away. For a moment, Miles just stood there, staring. He had seen many things in his years as a salvager: old droids, alien bones, lost data drives, but never a living creature on Karos 4. He knelt beside her and slowly lifted his hand. She flinched, her glowing eyes wide with fear. Her breath came out in soft gasps. "Hey!" he said quietly, his voice muffled through the mask. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't understand his words, but something in his tone made her stop crying. Her eyes followed his hand as he pulled a repair cloak from his pack and draped it over her small body. The fabric hissed as the rain hit it, forming a weak shield against the acid. Miles looked at her injuries and frowned. He could see the burns along her back and the blisters forming on her arms. "You poor thing," he muttered. He looked around the wreckage, knowing they couldn't stay here. The storm was getting worse, and the acid would soon eat through the metal. He lifted the small creature gently, wrapping her in the cloak. She was light, too light, and her breathing was uneven. Miles carried her back through the rain, his boots splashing through the steaming puddles. The acid hissed louder now, but he didn't stop. Each drop left small marks on his armor, but he ignored the pain. He reached his ship and placed her inside, sealing the airlock. The hum of the filters filled the small cabin as he took off his helmet. The girl lay on the floor, wrapped in the cloak, her chest rising and falling slowly. Miles watched her for a long moment, unsure of what to do next. He had come to Caro's 4 for metal and scrap, not to rescue a dying alien. But as he looked at her pale face, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. The need to help, no matter the cost. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside the small ship, there was a fragile sense of peace. Miles started the engines and turned toward his outpost. The acid rain continued to fall, hissing against the metal, but for the first time, it seemed just a little quieter. Miles Carter sat in the pilot's seat of his small ship, watching the storm clouds swirl outside. The engines hummed softly, shaking the metal floor. His visor was fogged with condensation, and the sound of the acid rain against the hull echoed like steady drums. He had been to many dangerous worlds before, but Caro's 4 always felt different. It wasn't just empty. It felt forgotten, like the planet itself wanted to be left alone. He looked down at the small alien lying on the bed in the back of the ship. She was still wrapped in the repair cloak, her breathing weak but steady. The burns on her skin had stopped smoking, and her pale eyes were closed. Miles wasn't sure what she was or where she came from. He only knew that if he had left her there, she wouldn't have survived another hour. He poured a small amount of filtered water into a metal cup and placed it beside her. She stirred slightly, blinking up at the ceiling, then turned her head toward him. Her gaze was full of confusion and fear. Miles crouched down beside her and spoke softly. "Hey there, you're safe now. The rain can't hurt you in here." She tilted her head, not understanding the words but sensing the tone. Her eyes were bright, glowing faintly under the dim lights. Miles reached for a small med kit from the wall and carefully opened it. The smell of antiseptic filled the air as he mixed a mild neutralizing gel. He looked at her burns and hesitated. "This might sting a bit," he said quietly, "but it'll help." He dipped a cloth in the gel and gently dabbed it onto her wounds. She flinched at first, then relaxed when the burning stopped. Miles worked carefully, wiping away the residue of the acid and covering the worst injuries with soft bandages. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and sighed. There. Not perfect, but better than before. He looked at her again, wondering what kind of creature she was. Her features were almost human but finer, her skin pale and smooth like glass. Small gill-like marks lined the sides of her neck, and faint blue veins glowed under her skin. She blinked slowly, watching his every move. Miles stood and returned to the cockpit. He checked the sensors again, making sure no one was following him. The scanner showed nothing but the storm. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He set the ship on autopilot toward his outpost, a small shelter he had built years ago from old mining parts. He turned his chair around and looked back at the alien again. "Guess it's just you and me for now," he said softly. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The trip back took nearly an hour. The storm outside never stopped. Sheets of green rain slammed against the ship's hull, and the wipers struggled to keep the glass clear. Miles kept his hands steady on the controls. Every few minutes, he checked on the small creature. She seemed calmer now, watching him with wide eyes. When they finally reached the outpost, Miles landed the ship in a covered bay. The roof above hissed as the acid rain splashed down, but the interior was safe. The outpost was small, just a workshop, a sleeping area, and a storage unit. It wasn't much, but it was home. He lifted the alien gently and carried her inside. The air was dry and warm, filled with the faint hum of generators. He laid her on a cot and wrapped her in a clean blanket. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from one machine to another. When a small maintenance drone floated by, she flinched and covered her face. "Easy," Miles said. "It's not going to hurt you. That's just Rusty. He helps me fix things." The little drone beeped softly, curious. It hovered near her, projecting a soft light that scanned her condition. When the drone made a gentle chirp, Miles smiled. See? Even Rusty likes you. Leary, he didn't know her name yet, but that was who she was. Looked back at the drone, then at him. Her voice was soft when she spoke, almost a whisper of sound that wasn't quite words. Miles frowned, trying to understand. I don't know what you're saying, he admitted. But I'll figure it out. He turned to a cabinet and pulled out a tray of nutrient packs. You probably need food, huh? He heated one up and poured it into a bowl, setting it beside her. The smell wasn't pleasant, but it was safe. She hesitated, then reached out with trembling hands. When she tasted it, her eyes widened. It wasn't good, but it wasn't poison either. She ate slowly, pausing every few bites to study him. Miles sat back in a chair, watching quietly. You're tougher than you look, he said. Most folks wouldn't last 5 minutes out there. She finished eating and lay back down, her eyelids heavy. Within minutes, she was asleep again. Miles stood and turned off the main lights, leaving only a soft glow from the corner lamp. He took off his jacket and rubbed his tired eyes. He didn't know what he had just gotten himself into. Rescuing her had been the right thing to do, but it also meant trouble. If anyone found out he was harboring an alien, especially one that wasn't supposed to exist, the corporations would come looking. Still, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. He looked at her one last time before heading to his workbench. The sound of the storm outside was distant now, muffled by thick walls. For the first time in a long while, Miles felt a strange sense of calm. He didn't know who she was or why she was on Caro's for, but one thing was certain. He wasn't leaving her behind. Miles woke early the next day. The sound of the storm outside had not stopped. The acid rain beat against the roof like constant static, a reminder that Caro's for never rested. He stood from his cot and stretched, his muscles sore from the previous day's work. The air inside the outpost was warm and dry, but outside, the toxic wind still howled. He turned toward the small bed in the corner. The alien girl was awake. She sat up slowly, her eyes wide and glowing faintly in the dim light. The blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, and her pale skin shimmered faintly, healed a little more overnight. She stared at the room with cautious curiosity, like a lost animal trying to understand a new cage. Miles smiled faintly. Morning, he said, though he knew she didn't understand. You look better. She tilted her head, blinking at the sound of his voice. Her mouth opened slightly, and she spoke a few soft sounds, more like notes than words. Miles sat down across from her and nodded. Yeah, I know. You don't understand me. That's okay. He opened a small box and pulled out a few nutrient packs. Food, he said, showing her the packet before heating it in a small pot. The smell of warm broth filled the air. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes following every movement. When he handed her the bowl, she hesitated, then took it with both hands. Steam rose in the cold air, and she drank slowly. Good, Miles said quietly. You'll need your strength. After she finished, Miles walked to his workbench. He began checking his gear, his tools, weapons, and scanners. Caro's 4 wasn't safe, and the storm could tear through structures without warning. While he worked, he kept glancing back at her. She was watching him too, her small eyes tracing every move he made. After a while, she made a small sound, like a question. Miles turned and smiled. What's that? You curious about this junk? He picked up a small device and turned it on. A blue light blinked softly on its surface. She reached out and touched it, then flinched at the vibration. He chuckled. Don't worry, it's just a scanner. Won't bite. He showed her how the device scanned nearby metals, displaying readings on a small screen. She leaned closer, fascinated. Miles was surprised by how quickly she understood. Her eyes flicked between the light and the display as if trying to memorize it. She touched the screen again, careful this time, and a faint smile appeared on her face. Miles froze. He hadn't seen her smile before. It was small, almost hidden, but it was there. Something inside him softened. You're smarter than you look, he said softly. Hours passed. The storm continued outside, but the outpost was quiet. Miles worked on repairing a broken power coil while she watched from the cot. Sometimes she would stand and walk around the room, her movements light and slow. She touched the walls, the tools, even the small maintenance drone named Rusty, who buzzed happily in response. By evening, the storm began to calm slightly. Miles decided to check the communication array outside to make sure it hadn't been damaged. He put on his protective suit and turned to her. "Stay here. Okay? I'll be back soon." She tilted her head again, confused. Miles tapped his chest and then the door. "Me," he said, pointing at himself. "Outside." Then he gestured to her and the bed. "You. Stay." It took her a moment, but she nodded slowly. Miles smiled. "Good. I'll be back." He stepped outside into the green mist. The air hissed against his armor, and the rain burned small marks into the metal. He moved carefully through the sludge, checking the cables that ran along the walls. The storm had weakened but was still dangerous. After confirming that everything was intact, he started back toward the outpost. When he opened the door, he froze. The small alien was standing near the entrance, staring at him with wide eyes. She had followed him. Her bare feet were red and burned from the brief contact with the acid. Miles cursed and rushed forward, pulling her inside. "What were you thinking?" he said sharply, his voice trembling with worry. She winced at his tone and looked down, holding her burned feet. Miles sighed, his anger fading. "Damn it. You didn't know." He guided her back to the cot and grabbed the medical kit again. Carefully, he cleaned and wrapped her injuries. She didn't cry this time. She just watched him with those bright, silent eyes. When he finished, he sat beside her, breathing heavily. "You can't go out there," he said quietly. "That rain will kill you." She looked at him for a long moment, then reached out slowly and touched his gloved hand. Her fingers were cold and light as air. Miles froze, feeling the small touch through the fabric. Her voice came softly, strange but filled with emotion. It wasn't human speech, but somehow he understood the feeling behind it. Gratitude. He smiled faintly. "You're welcome." For a long while, they sat in silence. The storm outside continued to hiss and rumble, but inside the outpost, the air felt calm. Miles leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. He had no idea what this creature's story was, but he could already tell she wasn't just some lost animal. There was intelligence in her eyes, sadness too. She had seen something terrible. As the lights dimmed for night mode, the alien curled up under the blanket again. Miles watched her until her breathing slowed and she drifted into sleep. Then he stood and looked out through the narrow window at the acid rain falling across the dead planet. "Who are you?" he whispered to the storm. "And what happened to you out there?" The rain answered with a hiss, and the wind howled like a cry. Miles turned away and sat down beside the sleeping alien, listening to the rhythm of the storm until sleep finally claimed him too. The storm outside lasted for 2 more days. Acid rain fell without pause, turning the world beyond the walls into a steaming wasteland. Inside the outpost, Miles and the small alien settled into an uneasy rhythm. She spent most of her time resting, still weak from her wounds, while Miles worked quietly on repairs and kept the generators running. He had started calling her Leary. The name had come to him one night as he watched her sleep. It sounded gentle, like her. And when he said it aloud the next morning, she looked up at him with curiosity, as if she somehow recognized it. From that moment on, he called her Leary, and she didn't seem to mind. Miles did his best to care for her. Each day, he changed her bandages, cleaned her burns, and gave her small portions of food. She was eating better now, her strength slowly returning. Sometimes she tried to mimic his words, repeating short sounds clumsily. Other times, she would hum softly to herself, a tune that reminded Miles of wind chimes in the distance. The outpost, usually a place of silence and machines, began to feel alive again. One morning, Miles found her standing by the small window, staring at the storm outside. The acid rain traced glowing lines down the glass. She turned when she heard him and pointed at the horizon, her face full of wonder. Miles joined her, careful not to get too close to the window. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's something, isn't it? Beautiful in a deadly sort of way." She made a small sound, something between agreement and sadness. Miles could tell she didn't see beauty in it the way he did. For her, the rain was pain. It was the reason she had been dying when he found her. He thought about asking her what had happened before he found her, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know. Later that day, he sat at his workbench repairing a broken comms unit while Leary watched. She had grown braver around his tools and machines. Sometimes she would reach out and hand him parts, her movements careful and precise. Miles found himself teaching her without thinking, showing her which wires connected, which bolts fit where. She seemed to learn quickly, her bright eyes following every motion. "Not bad," Miles said as she handed him a spanner at the right moment. "You're a natural." Leary tilted her head, not understanding, but she smiled anyway. That evening, while Miles cooked their simple meal, the power flickered. The lights dimmed and then came back. The storm outside must have struck one of the outer panels. Miles sighed and checked the energy monitor. The readings showed low output. "Looks like I'll have to go out and fix that soon," he muttered. Leary watched him, her expression tense. She didn't need to understand the words to know he planned to go outside. She shook her head quickly and made a soft, urgent sound. Miles looked at her and smiled. "Don't worry, I'll be careful. I've done it 100 times. She didn't relax. She reached out and grabbed his sleeve, her small hand trembling. Miles paused, then gently patted her hand. "I'll be fine, Leary. Promise." He didn't go out that night. Instead, he sat by the heater while Leary curled up nearby, the blanket around her shoulders. She looked at him quietly for a while, then made a soft, musical sound. Miles frowned. "What's that?" She repeated it, then pointed at him. The sound was low and steady, almost like a word. Miles blinked. "Are you trying to say my name?" She tried again. "Me, L." He laughed softly, surprised. "Miles, that's right. Close enough." Leary smiled faintly and repeated it again, a little clearer. "Miles." Hearing her speak his name stirred something deep in him. It had been a long time since anyone had said it like that, with warmth. He nodded. "Yeah, that's me." For the next few days she grew stronger. Her burns healed faster than he expected. She moved around the outpost more confidently now, examining the machines and sometimes helping him organize his tools. Miles taught her simple words: food, water, light, safe, and she learned quickly. Her voice was soft but melodic, her speech broken but clear enough to understand. At night, Miles sometimes woke to find her sitting by the window, watching the storm. She would hum her quiet song, the same one she had been singing since the day he found her. It was lonely and beautiful. One night, he asked her, "That song, where's it from?" She turned her head slowly and pointed to the sky. Then she placed her hand over her heart. "Home," she said softly. Miles nodded, his chest tightening. "Home," he repeated. "Yeah, I get that." There was silence for a while. The storm outside had calmed, the rain falling slower now, quieter. Leary looked at him and spoke another word. "Lost." Miles looked down. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." That night, as he sat by the dying firelight, Miles realized how much his life had changed in just a few days. Before, Carosfor had been nothing more than a job, a place to find scrap and survive one more day. But now there was someone else to care for, someone who made the silence less heavy. Leary wasn't just a creature he had saved. She was something more, a reminder that even in a dead world, there could still be life, still be hope. As he drifted off to sleep, the storm outside finally began to fade. The rain still fell, but softer now, almost gentle. And for the first time since he arrived on Carosfor, Miles dreamed of something other than rust and silence. He dreamed of stars, of light, and of a small, glowing girl who had brought warmth back into his cold world. The days passed quietly. The acid rain had slowed, and for the first time in months, sunlight broke through the thick clouds above Carosfor. It wasn't much, just a faint glow, but it was enough to turn the green mist into gold. Miles stood outside the outpost in his protective suit, checking the solar panels, while Leary watched from the window. She still couldn't go out. Even with the storm fading, the air was too harsh for her fragile skin. When Miles came back in, he removed his helmet and smiled at her. Almost done. Give it another few days and we might even have clean power again. Leary tilted her head, her eyes bright. She repeated one of the words he had been teaching her. Cleaned power. That's right, he said, chuckling. You're learning fast. She smiled faintly, her voice soft. Miles teach, Leary learn. He felt a strange warmth at that. He had spent years working alone, talking only to his tools or the occasional trader who didn't care to remember his name. But Leary listened. She paid attention. And more than that, she seemed to care. That evening, as the faint sunlight dimmed, Leary sat across from him near the heater. She seemed thoughtful, her eyes distant. Miles noticed and asked, "What's on your mind?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed her eyes and placed a hand on her chest. A faint blue light pulsed beneath her skin. Miles leaned forward, curious. Then she reached out, touching his hand. A soft warmth spread from her fingers to his, and suddenly, he saw. Images flashed in his mind like memories that weren't his. He saw towering metal buildings, silver skies, and a group of beings who looked like Leary, tall, graceful, with pale, glowing skin. They sang as they worked, building something vast and bright. Then came the fire. Explosions tore through their world. Ships descended from the clouds, human ships, soldiers in black armor. Screams. The rain that fell wasn't acid then, but it burned all the same. Miles pulled his hand back, gasping. Leary's eyes were wet with tears. She whispered one word, her voice trembling. Human. He stared at her, heart heavy. That was us? She nodded slowly. Humans came, took, hurt, burned sky. Miles looked away. He had heard rumors over the years, stories of colonization gone wrong, of alien species wiped out in the name of progress. But he'd never seen it like that, never felt it. The horror of it was more than words could describe. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't know." Leary looked at him for a long moment, studying his face. Then she shook her head gently. "Miles, not same. You help." He met her gaze, unsure what to say. The guilt pressed heavy on his chest. "Doesn't matter. My kind did it. People like me." She reached out again, her small hand resting on his. "You different." The simple words broke something inside him. Miles had always known that humans weren't perfect, but seeing the damage they had done to her people made him feel like a stranger to his own kind. He leaned back, staring at the flickering light of the heater. Leary continued to speak softly, her broken words forming pictures of her world. How her people had lived in harmony with nature. How they had harnessed energy through song and sound instead of machines. How the humans had come to mine their world for rare minerals, ignoring their pleas. How the skies had turned dark, and the acid rains had begun after the humans' factories poisoned the air. When she finished, there was silence. Only the faint hum of the generator filled the room. Miles rubbed his hands over his face. "No wonder you were afraid of me when I found you." Leary tilted her head. "Afraid, but hope." He looked up. "Hope." She nodded. "Hope humankind. Maybe again." Miles didn't know what to say to that. He felt both unworthy and determined all at once. "I'll make sure no one hurts you again," he said finally. "I promise." Leary looked at him, and for the first time, she smiled fully, soft and warm. The glow in her eyes shimmered like the last bit of sunlight through the storm clouds. That night, Miles couldn't sleep. He sat at his workbench, staring at the old comms array. The guilt and anger inside him wouldn't rest. He thought of the corporations that had done this, of the soldiers who followed orders without question. He thought of Leary's pain, her lost home, and her quiet strength. He wanted to do something, anything, to make it right. He opened a file on his console, an old communication log. There were still frequencies used by the mining corporations. If he could repair the long-range transmitter, Maybe he could find out what had happened to Leary's world. Maybe there were others like her. Maybe some had survived. The idea gave him purpose. For the first time in years, he wasn't just fixing machines to survive. He was fixing them for someone else, for something that mattered. The next morning, when Leary woke, she found him already working on the transmitter. She walked over and watched him connect the cables. He glanced at her and smiled faintly. "We're going to find out where you came from," he said. "And maybe, just maybe, we'll find others like you." Leary's eyes widened. "Others, alive? I hope so." He paused, tightening a bolt. "If not, then we'll make sure the people who did this never get the chance to do it again." Leary placed a hand on his arm. "Together." Miles nodded. "Yeah, together." Outside, the storm had faded to a quiet drizzle. The world was still broken, but inside the small outpost, something had begun to heal. A fragile understanding had taken root, a bridge between what humanity had destroyed and what one human was trying to make right again. Days passed quietly after Miles began repairing the transmitter. The air on Caro's 4 had grown calmer, though the sky still shimmered with faint green light. Leary was stronger now, able to walk slowly around the outpost without fear. She followed Miles as he worked, curious about every tool and every sound the machines made. He had started to enjoy her company. The silence of his old life had been replaced with small questions, soft laughter, and moments of peace he hadn't felt in years. But peace never lasted long on Caro's 4. One morning, as he was calibrating the transmitter, the console flickered. The signal booster caught a faint transmission. Miles frowned. "That's not supposed to happen," he muttered. He tapped the screen. The signal grew stronger, encrypted but familiar. Leary tilted her head. "What is it?" Miles's voice dropped. "A corporate patrol frequency." He tried to jam it, but it was too late. The transmitter had already sent out a burst of energy, a signature that could easily be traced. He cursed under his breath and shut everything down. "They'll pick up on this. We need to move." Leary's glow dimmed in fear. "Humans? Bad ones?" Miles nodded grimly. "The worst kind." For the next few hours, he worked fast, packing supplies and dismantling what he could carry. He loaded fuel cells, tools, and the few food packs he had left into his rover. Leary helped as much as she could, moving small items and watching the door nervously. But before they could finish, the warning alarm on the radar began to wail. 3 ships had entered Caro's IV's atmosphere. Miles looked out the viewport. Through the thick haze, he could see the faint lights of descending crafts. "They found us," he said. His stomach tightened. He knew that sound, the deep hum of corporate engines. It had been years since he'd heard it, but he would never forget it. Leary stepped back, her eyes wide. "They come take." He gritted his teeth. "Not if I can help it." The ships landed nearby, their bright searchlights cutting through the fog. Miles guided Leary toward the back of the outpost. "Stay in the storage room. Don't come out until I tell you. No matter what you hear." She grabbed his sleeve. "Miles, please." He forced a small smile. "It's okay. I've dealt with people like this before." She hesitated, then nodded, slipping away into the shadows. Moments later, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the corridor. Miles grabbed his plasma wrench and stood by the control console. The door burst open, and a squad of armored soldiers marched in, weapons raised. At their center stood Commander Ellis, a tall man in a black uniform, his expression cold and precise. "Carter," Ellis said, his voice calm but sharp. "It's been a long time." Miles didn't move. "Didn't know I was worth visiting." Ellis stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the outpost. "We detected unauthorized transmissions, corporate property frequencies. You've been busy." His eyes narrowed. "And we also detected a non-human life form. Care to explain that?" Miles's hand tightened on the wrench. "Just me here." Ellis gave a faint smile. "We both know you're lying. The scans don't make mistakes." He motioned to his soldiers. "Search the area." Miles moved to block the corridor. "You're not touching anything in here." Ellis tilted his head slightly. You're protecting it. That means it's valuable. You always did have a soft spot for broken things. Miles said nothing. His jaw clenched. The soldiers began to move forward, but Miles acted first. He swung the wrench at the nearest one, knocking his weapon aside. Sparks flew as plasma met armor. The room filled with shouts and energy blasts. Miles ducked behind the console, rolling to the side as a shot scorched the wall above him. Ellis stepped back, eyes narrowing. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Carter," Miles shouted over the noise. "You already made it hard when you came here." He hit the emergency seal on the door, cutting the soldiers off from the back of the outpost, where Leary was hiding. The steel shutters locked into place with a hiss. Then he grabbed a smoke grenade from his tool belt and threw it. Thick vapor filled the room, blinding the soldiers. Miles darted through the haze, striking where he could, using his knowledge of the outpost's layout to stay one step ahead. But there were too many of them. He stumbled back, panting, his armor scorched and cracked. Ellis raised his pistol, aiming for Miles's chest. "You're wasting your time. Whatever you're hiding, it belongs to the corporation." Then the floor trembled. A low hum filled the air, followed by a burst of blue light. From the back of the outpost, the door exploded outward. Leary stood there, glowing fiercely, her eyes burning with defiance. The soldiers stumbled back in shock. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice echoing with strange resonance. Ellis turned toward her, startled. "What?" Before he could finish, a pulse of energy rippled from Leary's hands. The lights shattered, consoles sparked, and the soldiers were thrown backward as if hit by a wave of invisible force. Miles barely managed to stay on his feet. When the light faded, the outpost was silent. The soldiers lay unconscious, their armor cracked and smoking. Leary stood trembling, the glow fading from her skin. She looked at Miles weakly and collapsed. He caught her before she hit the floor. Hey, it's okay," he whispered, holding her close. "You did good. You're safe." Ellis groaned from the corner, trying to get up. Miles glared at him. "You tell your bosses this planet's off-limits. You come back, and I won't be so gentle." Ellis's eyes flicked to Leary, then to Miles. "You don't know what you're protecting," he said coldly. "That thing is dangerous." Miles stood, still holding Leary. "No. What's dangerous is people like you." He dragged Ellis to the airlock and forced him outside, sealing the door behind him. Then he slumped against the wall, breathing hard. Leary stirred faintly in his arms, whispering, "Miles, safe." He smiled tiredly. "Yeah, we're safe. For now." Outside, the rain began to fall again, hissing softly against the metal walls. Inside, Miles held on to the only thing that mattered now, a fragile hope, glowing faintly in his arms. The night after the attack, the outpost was quiet. The power flickered, and the smell of burnt metal hung in the air. Miles sat beside Leary's resting form, wiping soot and ash from her pale skin. Her glow was faint now, but her breathing was steady. He felt relief but also fear. He knew Ellis would not stop. Corporate command would send more ships once the first patrol failed to report in. He stared at the damaged control console. They couldn't stay here anymore. The corporation would come in greater numbers next time, and there was no way he could protect Leary alone. He had to find a way off the planet. When Leary awoke, her voice was weak. "They come again?" Miles nodded slowly. "Yeah, they will." She looked at him with wide, tired eyes. "You go. Leave. They hurt you." He shook his head. "I'm not leaving you behind." Leary reached out, touching his hand. "You good. But humans more come." "I know," he said, his jaw tightening. "That's why we have to fight back." She blinked, confused. "Fight back?" "Yeah," Miles said, standing. "They think we're just a man and a dying alien. Let's prove them wrong." He began working on the generator, rerouting power to the defense grid. The outpost wasn't built for war, but Miles had been an engineer long enough to know how to improvise. He scavenged old mining drones, converted them into makeshift sentries, and set up explosive traps around the perimeter. Leary watched silently, her expression mixed with worry and admiration. "Miles, you risk life." He looked at her with a faint smile. "It's not just my life anymore." 2 days later, the scanners detected more incoming ships. Larger ones this time. Miles felt his chest tighten as he saw their signatures. "3 cruisers," he murmured. "They brought the whole division." Leary stepped beside him. "We hide." He shook his head. "No. We make them wish they never came here." As the ships descended, the air trembled. Miles activated the drones and armed the perimeter charges. The outpost hummed with energy, shields flickering to life. He took a deep breath, glancing at Leary. "Stay in the back. If things go bad, you know what to do." Leary frowned. "You say that too often." He laughed softly. "Then promise me you'll still listen." She didn't answer, but her glowing eyes said enough. The first wave of soldiers landed with a thunderous crash. Metal pods hit the ground and opened, releasing squads of armored troopers. Miles hit a switch and explosions ripped through the ground, throwing several soldiers aside. The drones flew out next, firing blue streaks of plasma across the field. The battle for Karos 4 had begun. Miles ran between cover points, firing his modified pulse rifle. Every shot echoed through the broken valley. The soldiers fought hard, but the terrain worked in his favor. Acid rain began to fall again, eating through their armor. Screams filled the air. From above, Ellis's voice crackled through a loudspeaker. "Carter, you can't win this. Surrender and we'll spare you." Miles snarled and fired another burst. "You've already taken enough." Inside the outpost, Leary felt the tremors shake the floor. She could hear the battle outside, the explosions and the cries. Fear rose in her chest, but she pushed it down. She couldn't just wait anymore. She closed her eyes, focusing on the energy inside her. The strange power she still didn't understand. Pulsed weakly, but it was there. Outside, Miles ducked behind a metal crate, reloading. His shoulder was burned, and his arm ached. The soldiers were advancing. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever. Then the sky flared. A beam of blue light shot upward from the outpost, slicing through the clouds. The rain stopped midair, frozen as if time itself had paused. The soldiers looked up in confusion as Leary stepped out of the door, glowing brighter than ever before. Her eyes blazed, and her voice rang across the battlefield. "Stop!" The soldiers faltered, their weapons lowering. The air around her shimmered with energy. Miles stared, awe and fear mixing in his chest. "Leary, what are you doing?" She turned to him, her expression calm and sad. "Protect you." Before he could stop her, she lifted her hands. The energy pulsed outward, forming a vast shield dome over the outpost. Acid rain slid off harmlessly, the light holding strong. The soldiers fired, but their shots dissolved against the field. Ellis shouted through the comms, "All units, focus fire on the alien." Leary gasped but stood firm. Every blast that hit the barrier shook her body, her light flickering. Miles ran toward her, shouting her name. "Leary, stop. You can't hold it forever." She looked at him, smiling faintly. "Long enough." The barrier rippled violently. Miles reached her just as a surge of power burst outward. The energy wave swept across the battlefield, knocking soldiers and ships off balance. Consoles exploded, ships crashed into the mud, and silence followed. When the light faded, Leary was on her knees, her glow barely visible. Miles caught her as she fell. Hey, stay with me," he said, voice breaking. Her lips moved weakly. "You safe?" He nodded, tears in his eyes. "Yeah, you saved us." She smiled faintly. "Worth it." Miles shook his head. No, you don't get to say that. You're going to be fine." She reached up, touching his cheek with a trembling hand. "Humans can change." Then her hand fell. Miles held her close, his heart pounding. The world was silent except for the soft hiss of fading rain. Around them, the wrecks of ships burned in the distance. He stood slowly, cradling her in his arms. The acid rain no longer fell inside the barrier she had created. It was still holding, even without her strength. The sky above was clearing for the first time in years. Miles looked up at the light breaking through the clouds and whispered, "You changed everything." The morning after the battle was unlike any other on Karos 4. The air, once thick with acid mist, was clear. The sky, long hidden behind a curtain of green clouds, showed a faint blue hue for the first time in years. Miles sat outside the outpost with Lyri's body resting gently in his arms. Her glow had faded completely now, but her face was calm, almost peaceful. She looked as if she were only sleeping. Around them, the wreckage of the corporate ships still smoked. The drones were gone, the soldiers scattered. The silence that followed the chaos felt heavy, yet strangely pure. For the first time, Karos 4 was quiet. Not the dead kind of quiet that Miles had known for years, but something new, something alive. He laid Lyri down gently on a clean sheet of fabric, then stood to look around. The dome of light she had created was still faintly visible, shimmering across the horizon. Where the acid rain once burned, now grass and small shoots of green were beginning to grow. The poison in the air was fading. She had changed the planet itself. Miles knelt beside her again. His voice was soft. "You did it, Lyri. You saved us. You saved everything." For a while he didn't move. He just sat there, listening to the gentle wind. It carried no ash, no acid, only the sound of a new beginning. By noon, Miles gathered what he could. He buried Lyri on the hill behind the outpost, the place where he first saw the storm break. He used smooth metal plates to form a small marker and carved one word into it: Lyri. It didn't feel like enough, but it was all he had. He stood there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. For years, he had lived for nothing but survival, one day at a time, fixing machines no one cared about. Now, because of her, he cared again. Because of her, the world had changed. When the wind shifted, he thought he heard a faint hum in the air. A melody, soft and distant. The same song she had always sung. He closed his eyes and smiled. "I hear you," he whispered. After the burial, Miles returned to the outpost and repaired what he could. He powered up the long-range transmitter and scanned for signals. The console flickered with static at first, but then, something new. A faint pulse. A coded transmission unlike the corporate ones. He adjusted the frequency, and the static gave way to a familiar tone, followed by a voice. "This is Research Vessel Horizon scanning outer sectors. Receiving unknown energy readings. Possible non-hostile life signatures detected. Please respond." Miles stared at the console in disbelief. It wasn't a corporate signal, it was civilian, independent, maybe even friendly. He pressed the comm button. "This is Miles Carter, Outpost Engineer, Karos 4. I read you, Horizon." There was a pause, then the voice replied, surprised. "Carter? Karos 4 is classified as uninhabitable. How are you alive down there?" Miles looked out at the brightening sky. "Long story," he said quietly. "But the planet's changing. It's healing." "Healing?" the voice repeated. "That's impossible." The chemical balance was irreversible. Miles smiled faintly. "It's not anymore." There was another pause. Then the voice spoke again, softer this time. "Understood, Carter. We'll dispatch a recovery team. Hold tight." Miles ended the transmission and sat back in his chair. He wasn't sure what kind of people they would send, curious scientists or opportunistic scavengers, but he would be ready either way. Lyri had given him a reason to fight, to protect what was left of her world. As the day went on, he worked outside, gathering the remaining scrap into organized piles. He took apart one of the fallen ships and used the parts to build a small beacon. When night fell, he activated it. A soft blue light rose into the sky, joining the stars. Standing beneath that light, Miles thought about what Lyri had said before she died: humans can change. He wanted to believe that. He had seen what greed could destroy, but he had also seen what compassion could save. He promised himself that when the new team arrived, he would tell them everything. Not just about the battle or the corporation, but about Lyri. About her world. About what she did for Karos 4. Maybe they would understand. Maybe they wouldn't. But her story had to live on. Days passed and the world continued to change. The acid in the soil was fading, and the air grew easier to breathe. Small creatures, long thought extinct, began to return to the surface. It was as if the planet itself was waking from a long, painful sleep. One evening, as the first rain since the battle began to fall, Miles stepped outside. This rain was clear, pure water. He lifted his hand and let it run over his skin. It was cold, but it didn't burn. For the first time in his life, he felt the touch of clean rain. He looked up at the sky, the clouds glowing faintly orange in the fading sunlight. "You did it, Leary," he whispered. "You brought the world back." The gentle sound of the rain was joined by that same melody again. Faint but real, carried by the wind. He smiled, closing his eyes. Maybe it was his imagination, or maybe she was still out there, watching. Either way, he knew one thing for certain. She had changed everything. As the rain continued to fall, Miles turned back toward the outpost. There was work to do, a world to rebuild, a promise to keep. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Above him, the clouds parted, and a beam of sunlight touched the ground. Karos 4, once a world of acid and ash, was alive again. The dawn after the rain had finally come.